So let's turn to today's game. And Larsen playing white, Spassky black in the USSR World Match, an historic occasion. And Larsen played this really unexpected move.
It's got to be extremely unusual, right? Surely.
Certainly is. I mean, in all the games we've seen so far, white's always kicked off with E4, or more frequently D4, or the English opening C4. And now here's Larsen in a really key game, playing a move that's quite out of the ordinary. But Larsen actually became an expert in this rather unusual opening, and it's now called Larsen's opening. I mean, when he played it against Spassky, he hadn't quite fathomed out all the complexities, but in coming games he found nuances and niceties, and he elaborated the strategic ideas and actually turned it into quite a fearsome weapon. And Spassky, as one would expect, played a vigorous classical response. He put a pawn bang in the centre of the board. And Larsen attacked it. And Spassky brought out his knight to c6 to defend the pawn. Now, if white's opening has a point, and of course it does have a point, the point must be to batter a path for the white bishop on b2 through the centre and try to erode the black pawn on e5.
In that sense, would it be too fanciful to say it's a kind of queenside reti?
Yes, it is a kind of queenside reti opening with the fianchetto of the queen's bishop. And white's strategy has to be to hit the black pawn on e5, to make it move out of the way, or somehow capture it, sidestep it, to force it to move, to increase the power of the bishop on b2. If black can set up a blockade in the path of that bishop, the piece becomes useless, and it defeats the whole object of the opening. Now, the right way to do this, to continue the undermining process, is to play this move. And the point being, white then follows up by putting the bishop on b5, which is attacking the defender of the e5 pawn. And then moves like this can follow. The knight can come to e2, and white can play f4. And all this is in the interest of blasting a path for the queen's bishop. This is a very reasonable way for white to play the opening. But Larsen didn't do that. And in later games, he realised that this was in fact the right way to play the position. But here, in the early days against Spassky, when he hadn't sorted out all the tricks in the opening, he played this move, which is a kind of Sicilian defence with colours reversed. And this is really a bad move, and already white is failing to implement the key strategic ideas of the opening. And in fact, he's blocking the path of his king's bishop. He's actually playing a Sicilian defence, a tempo up.
It's a bad move for what reason?
It locks in the bishop on f1. And if black were to oblige and immediately play a move like d5 and offer a proper transposition to a reverse Sicilian, then it wouldn't be so bad. But black doesn't need to do that. And the pawn on c4 doesn't really help the white position at all. And Spassky simply brought out the other knight. And now Larsen really compounded the error of the previous move by playing much too provocatively. He brought out his knight to f3. And again, I would say that, let's put the knight back for a minute, that the safe way to play here would be either to develop the knight here to c3, looking at the d5 square, perhaps later on developing the other bishop on the flank to control d5. That's one way to play. Another sensible way to play would be to play pawn to e3, and then perhaps the pawn to d3, and then bring out the knight. There's nothing wrong with this. It's kind of passive, but it's not bad. But Larsen did none of these things. Larsen's noted as a provocative player. He likes to tempt his opponents, to encourage them to attack him, and in hopes to beat off the attack. And he played this move. Now, in a sense, it fulfills the strategic idea I mentioned of making the black e-pawn move forwards to clear a path for the white bishop. But it's taking on too many obligations. And the pawn did, in fact, move forwards, hitting the knight fairly vigorously. And the knight's got to move. And there's really no very good square for it. I mean, it could go to g5, for example, but black would just hit it with h6 and start chasing the knight all over the board.
Back to square one.
Yes, back to square one. That wouldn't be any good at all. He could put the knight in on e5, and black would trade it off. But again, white's piece would be wandering around rather homeless in the middle of the board. He could put it out here on the edge. But again, it's not a very good square at all. And it would be a dreadful struggle getting the piece back into the game again.
And if his knight is on, let's see, it's d5, e5, then what does he do if that queen's pawn nudges up there?
You mean if he plays this move?
Yes.
Yes. What black would do in this case would be to take the knight off. And white would have to take back again with the bishop. And then black would play this, as you so rightly say, moving the queen's pawn, chasing the bishop again, and black gets a big lead in development. So none of this happened. And what Larsen in fact did was he put his knight in the middle. It's the best of a bad choice at the moment. But even here, the knight can be kicked around some more. And what Spassky did, very simply, bishop c5. And this reminds me in a curious sort of way. Many weeks back we looked at the game Pauls and Morphy, number 2 in the series. And you remember that there, Morphy, in the interest of a quick development, didn't mind having his pawns doubled.
Yes.
And he also played the move bishop to c5 in the opening, which is a very aggressive move looking at the white king. And now Larsen really hasn't got much choice. His knight's attacked again.
So e3.
He could play e3, but it leaves a bad hole on the d3 square, and black might even immediately play a knight into e5.
Getting very ugly.
Yes. Or, that's one possibility. Another possibility would simply be to take this off, say with the bishop, doubling white's pawns, and then if white takes back with the pawn, to take over the whole centre of the board like this. It's a very nasty position for white. Put the pieces back. And the other possibility after e3, bishop takes d4, is to take with the bishop. But then again, he would take off. He'd take back and play d5. And the white double pawns in the middle are a dreadful mess. And white's almost losing this position already. It's a horrible position to get. So Larsen's already faced with a dilemma in this position. I mean, he could do this, which is dreadfully passive and retrograde, but he decided that he would accept the challenge and double the black pawns. So he took the black knight. And just like Morphy did, Spassky takes back.
Away from
the centre, yes. It's breaking one of the little rules, but it's better in theory to have the pawns
dangerous habits here.
Bunched into the centre.
It's going to get me into a lot of trouble at the club.
But here, the fact that black has such a free development immediately, pressure in the open d-file from the queen, the ability to bring this bishop out very quickly, all this adds up to more than adequate compensation for the double pawns. And again, there are so many similarities here with the Morphy game, the doubling of the pawns, the black bishop on the c5 square, the free scope of the black pieces, the black queen coming in the d-file. And white has to be very careful now. Of course, Larsen's an eternal optimist, and what he probably thought was, our double pawns, I'll win the endgame, which is really where double pawns become at their most weak and useless. But first of all, he has to get his pieces out. As Dr. Tarish said, before the endgame, the gods have annoyingly placed the middle game. Then Larsen did this. It's a sensible move. And out comes the bishop. So you can see that black's really got a very fluid and pleasant development here. Queen comes here. I think what Larsen's trying to do, actually, is he's trying to castle on the queen's side to get his king away from these rather dangerous-looking black pieces on the right-hand side. But Spassky's got the same idea. He also plays his queen out to e7. And Larsen plays this. Bishop to e2, a good developing move. And now Spassky connects the rooks.
I think Larsen's changing his mind castle-wise.
Well, we never find out, because he doesn't get to castle. So black castles queenside. Now the rook's in a very aggressive position. And Larsen chooses this moment to play a quite interesting move. He plays pawn to f4. And his idea is that black can't take that en passant because the queen will take the bishop with check. So he can't play this move because the bishop on f5 is hanging. And what Larsen's trying to do is to barricade the king's side in preparation for a move like this, followed by castling queenside. And I think many lesser players than Spassky would have been unable to exploit this. They would have allowed Larsen's strategy to triumph. But what Spassky does now is really tremendous. He just launches a devastating attack that based on some very, very subtle points. And it starts off with this move. Knight to g4. And one of the threats here is to play the queen out to h4 check. Which, of course, Larsen stops. And from now on, we all know Larsen's plan is to play knight c3 and castle queenside essentially. The whole focus of the battle shifts entirely to the right-hand side of the board. There's absolutely nothing that he can do to stop all the action taking place on the right-hand side where the black pieces are concentrated. And Spassky kicks off, starts the attack with this move, pawn to h5. And the clear intention is to ram this pawn forwards and just try to blast a hole in the white position. I'm sure Larsen had foreseen this and wasn't worried. And what he plays is this, pawn to h3, attacking the knight. Now, Donald, what would you do if you were black in this position? Let's say you had this game in a Surbiton club match.
I would get the knight back, wouldn't I? Get him right out of the area.
That would be the normal reaction.
Yes.
And there are two ways to bring the knight back. One is knight to h6, which actually isn't very good.
F6 I'd go for,
yes, and in that particular case, the bishop would take the pawn on g7. And that would really throw a spanner in the works from black's point of view.
Got to come to f6.
Yes. So the natural move, of course, is to put the knight back onto f6.
Yes, and you're going to tell me that that's not what he did.
It's not what he did. Yeah. Most people
That's why he doesn't play for Serbet.
And I remember that I was in the west of England in 1970 when this game was being played. I was preparing for an international team tournament with an English player called Peter Clark. And we were getting the moves of the games from Belgrade, from this great USSR world match, in Russian newspapers. And we got the moves of this game, and we simply could not believe what Spassky did now. And even after we'd seen it happen, we couldn't believe it. He leaves the knight where it is, and he pushes on this pawn. Fantastic move. Fantastic move. Now, of course, white can't take the pawn, and that would be immediately suicidal, because the black queen would come raging in, and that would be the end of the game immediately.
Yes.
But the position's become so threatening now that white must take the bait. He must take the knight. So he plays it. H takes g4. Maybe Larsen even foresaw this and still thought he was okay. Spassky takes this. So now he's given up a piece, but he has a dangerous looking passed pawn on g3.
Yeah.
And if white would say now to trade the rooks, say rook takes h8.
No harm done.
And rook takes back. Then, of course, white would be in a dreadful mess, because the rook is going to come into the white position. The rook is going to penetrate to this square, for example, with an absolutely deadly attack. It doesn't need a genius to see that this is going to be decisive. And the rook combined with the pawn on g3 would finish the game very quickly. But this didn't happen. Of course, Larsen's much too good a defensive player to fall for that. And I suspect he'd seen this sacrifice and he'd planned...
And he's been cursing his knight back there. That's why that stops him queenside.
Yes, he still can't castle queenside, but I think he thought he had a defence on the kingside. He played rook g1. And this looks like a defence, because he's now eyeing the black pawn on g3. There's no obvious attack for black in the H file. The bishop on f5 is attacked, and given a move, knight to c3, white can castle. He's safe and a piece up. And this is where we get the most fantastic move from Spassky. This unbelievable move, which just shocked me completely when I first saw it, and it's still hard to grasp. Now, I showed you the variation where the rook was it traded, and then black invaded with his own rook. What Spassky did was, he did it anyway. He played rook to h1.
Yes.
Just putting the rook where it can be taken.
Yes, at first sight it doesn't seem horribly threatening until you start looking at the implications.
Yeah, but just giving up a rook like this, white has no choice. The pistol's at his head. He must take it. Rook takes h1.
Can I ask a question there, Ray?
Of course.
Why doesn't he simply move his king over?
If he moves the king over like this, then black is bringing in the queen, which is devastating.
Yes.
And you'll see variations like this occurring in the game. So white must take the rook. Rook takes. The pawn comes on to g2, gaining the vital move that's needed.
So he's got to come back there.
Yes, and then when the rook comes here, for example, black is giving check.
Oh my good God, as Arthur Daly would say.
King is here. And the queen is coming in here, which is absolutely decisive. So we go back to the game position. What Larsen actually played was rook to here. The queen came in, check. King went away.
Oh, shit.
And now he took this check, and the game's over. White resigned in this position. He has to take back. Bishop takes f1. And now it's checkmate very quickly. Bishop takes pawn, check. Bishop e2. And then queen here, checkmate. An incredible game.
So it was that rook sacrifice that
it's the rook sacrifice that did it. It's quite amazing.
Yes, it is.
Absolutely amazing. I've never seen a rook sacrifice like that before.
But it's like genius in all spheres. When you're able to look at it deliberately, chew it over afterwards, you think, oh, brilliant. But that someone could have foreseen that then in the heat of play, with all the tension. It's a masterpiece, right?
We were talking about Spassky and Korchnoi before the game started. And I remember that Korchnoi-Spassky match that you showed me the book of, they were playing in separate cubicles, separate rooms there. And this is a remarkable way to play chess. Have you definitely
I once had a weird chess experience. I was banned in South Africa, and as a newspaper editor, it meant I couldn't write anything. But the security police were briefing me on what I couldn't do. I couldn't be in a room with more than one person, etc. And I said, I'm captain of the chess club, and are you telling me I can't go and play chess? And they said, of course not. You can't go into a chess club where there's a whole lot of other chess players. And having thought of this, I said, but you remember, the famous players, Bobby Fischer, Spassky, and the others, have played in a room on their own. I said, I will arrange to play against only one other player. And so Colonel von der Merwe thumbed through all his regulations, and he said, well, I can't see anything against that, but you'll have to be alone with one other player. So I said, right. Then he suddenly said, but you mustn't drink tea or coffee while you play.
No tea or coffee.
And it sounded so crazy. I said, but why? He said, well, the purpose of banning is to prevent a common social purpose with other people. And even if you're in a separate room, the other members of the chess club will be drinking tea or coffee. And this was so crazy. I remember saying to him, well, if I have Coke, would that be all right? And he just got angry with me.
But you managed to end up playing chess in the separate room.
Well, I did it twice, but it was actually so tense, these poor chaps, the other members, they didn't know if they were being watched by the police. So I ended up playing at home. They used to come up to the house and play me one at a time.
Donald, that's a wonderful story. Thanks very much indeed. So there we've seen Spassky at his imaginative best. But of course his greatest challenge still lay ahead. In 1972, his challenger for the world title was a brash, unschooled genius from Brooklyn, Bobby Fischer. The two of them had met in the 1966 Olympiad, and their clash of style and temperament was to produce the most memorable headline news in the history of the World Championship. the world's media gathered in Reykjavik in Iceland, but the start of play was constantly delayed. First, by Fischer's late arrival from America. Then, with Spassky ready and all the preparations made, by Fischer's late arrival for the first game. Fischer-Spassky 1972 has become a landmark in chess. Join us next week for that special confrontation. From Donald and me and Thames's chess team, goodbye for now.